Oh, there's too many of you cry. Brother, there's far too many of you die. You know,
Hit it mid all and they'll all come in at the same time.
to bring Mother, we don't need to escapade. Oh, it's not heaven, for only love can conquer. You know we got to find a way to bring some love in. Oh, yeah, yeah. Take it light, take it soft, punish me with brutality. Talk to me, honey, so you can see what's going on. Hey, what's going on? Tell me what's going on. Ooh, come on here. Everybody thinks we're wrong. They do. Mama, who are they to judge us? Simply cause our hair is long. People, we've got to find a way to bring some understanding. Yes, yes. Pick it loud, pick it sound. But don't punish me with brutality. Talk to me, talk to me, talk to me. So you
Welcome everybody. Welcome to our first event for Black History Month. We thank you for joining us today. Um, Before we get started, I'm just going to share with you guys a few rules. We are recording, so if you don't want to be recorded, you can go ahead and turn off your cameras. And then also we're going to have Q&A at the end, so we just asked if you can keep yourself muted until that time, until you have a question. Before we get started, I'm going to share with you guys a little history on Black History Month. So Black History Month is an annual celebration of achievements by African Americans and a time for recognizing their central role in the U.S. history, also known as African American History Month. The event grew out of Negro History Week, the brainchild of noted historian Carter G. Woodson and other prominent African Americans. Since 1976, every U.S. president has officially designated the month of February as Black History Month. Other countries around the world, including Canada and the United Kingdom, also devote a month to celebrating Black history. The Chaffey College Umoja program celebrates Black history along with the CCSJ and the CCSG. We celebrate this in acknowledgement of our ancestors who, through their work, perseverance, and suffering, made it possible for us to celebrate. So thank you for joining us today, and please review the Black History calendar for the events that we will have throughout this month. So we will go ahead and get started with Dr. Omar Dphrepaulezz' presentation. Um, Thank you for joining us.
Okay, welcome everybody, and thank you very much, Tiffany, for that great historical explanation of the importance and the significance of this month. And I hope thank all of you for coming. We've got quite a turnout here.
I appreciate that, and I hope that what I have to say stays with you. I hope that it's an interesting. I hope that it's helpful. I decided for my presentation this month that I wanted to deal with the issue of voting rights, specifically the issue of voter suppression. And I specifically focused on African American voter suppression because, of course, African American History Month. This is not to leave out the fact that voter suppression, especially in contemporary times, is directed specifically at African Americans, absolutely, but it affects everyone. It's an ominous development for our democracy. So I'm going to talk about the Supreme Court ruling Shelby versus Holder of 2013, and I'm going to also go over a brief history of African American voter suppression, probably with an emphasis on the history of voter suppression. Again, it's no coincidence that I chose this. We have an election that was characterized by just monumental attempts by people to suppress, especially African American voters, and culminated in a violent attack on the Capitol in an attempt actually to overthrow an election that had been primarily won by African American votes. So I'm a historian. I teach African American history, U.S. history, history of U.S. foreign policy. So of course I like to place everything in its historical context. So I generally reach back to tell a story about something that's going on today. And so I'm going to briefly go over Shelby versus Holder before I do that. And so again, this is a Supreme Court decision that was rendered June 25th, 2013. It was a very close decision, 5-4 decision. That basically addressed the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which I'll go over in greater detail as we get into the history. But just it's important for you to know right now that part of the Voting Rights Act was a section called Section 5 that called for pre-clearance of certain states before they were able to change their voting laws. So in other words, if the state of Mississippi, which had a horrendous historical pattern of violently suppressing African American voters, wanted to change its laws, they had to have it pre-cleared to the Department of Justice. Basically, what the Supreme Court did, I'm going to tell you in brief and go into greater detail later, was to enable, right, these states to get around the issue of pre-clearance. They no longer had to pre-clear any changes to the voting laws. And we saw the results of that on January 6th, and I'll talk about how and why. So I want to take us back to the post-Civil War South. Immediately after emancipation, the passage of the 13th Amendment, the end of the war, immediately after, white supremacists, primarily the elites and using the lower classes as foot soldiers, attempted to put in place a system as close to slavery as they possibly could without it being legally slavery. Right. And so this involved things like black codes, and black codes are different than Jim Crow laws. And I have to always try to emphasize this to my students in the sense that black codes were passed actually right after the Civil War. Right. And these were laws that specifically targeted African Americans. Right. And such as it prevented them from voting. It prevented them from gathering in groups. It prevented them from organizing politically in any way. It forced them to be employed. If they were not employed, they were arrested and were sent to work camps, which again, if you went to town and you were African American, you needed a note from your employer. If you were employed, you needed to have a note on you, proving that you were employed from your employer. So what does this sound like? This sounds like slavery. This was almost exactly the way the slave society worked. And this was no accident. What happens after the war, and President Lincoln is assassinated and Andrew Johnson becomes president, he really just wants to return things to the status quo without legal slavery. So one of the things that he does is he gives blanket amnesty to major Confederate figures who basically had committed treason, who had conspired to destroy the Republic. And a lot of these folks who were in the elite class basically, came back. Some of them had fled to Texas or what have you. Some of them hadn't went anywhere, but they end up in power, in political power, right? Running things the same as they were before the war, right? And in addition to this, you also have mostly returning Confederate veterans who begin to organize themselves into terrorist organizations. The most well-known one is, of course, the Ku Klux Klan, but there are actually several of them. There were the white shirts, the red shirts, the Knights of the White Camellia. These were widespread and numerous white supremacist terrorist organizations springing up all throughout the South. And what these individuals did was they basically worked in tandem with the government, right, to suppress, terrorize, brutalize African Americans, force them back into the fields, right, working for almost nothing. But most importantly, they wanted to keep African Americans from exercising political power, right? So you have this partnership with basically law enforcement, the political class, and terrorist organizations. It's like ISIS, right, in Iraq kind of thing, basically suppressing the African American population. Now, pushing back against this were African American veterans of the Civil War, who of course fought on the Union side. There were no Confederate African American soldiers, and freedmen, people who had been free, and some white co-conspirators who wanted to actually create this new republic that Lincoln had talked about, this dawn of a new form of freedom. I'm kind of paraphrasing his words. And these individuals are the ones who are pushing back, and they're trying to, first of all, they're trying to organize African Americans to be able to demand wages that they can actually live on. They're trying to break the old mentality and the bond of the master-slave relationship, right? And they're also trying to become actively involved in the political process, right? And they're going to be encouraged and supported by the so-called radical Republicans. We call them radical, but they were radical because what they wanted was for African-American freedmen to have the same rights and the same duties and responsibilities and privileges as any American citizen. And so this is going to be quite a combustible situation, right? And we're going to see throughout this period, what we saw in January 6th was not new. What was new was that it happened in DC, right? And what was new is that, I guess it wasn't even new that they were targeting white politicians, because they were doing it in this period as well. So there's a series of massacres that take place throughout, before radical Reconstruction and during that period, right? That were about pushing African Americans out of political power or keeping them out of political power. New Orleans Massacre is probably the earliest, or really it's important because it caused a backlash from the Republican Party, who, I want you to get your mind into the 19th century and realize that the Republican Party was the anti-slavery party, right? Whereas the Democratic Party was the pro-slavery, pro-Jim Crow party. The roles have reversed now. But anyway, July 30th, 1866 in New Orleans, Louisiana, the Louisiana State Constitutional Convention is meeting. In other words, these politicians are meeting to write a new constitution after the end of the war, right? The war is over. The Confederacy is no more theoretically, so they have to write a state constitution. Over 100 African-American freedmen marched to the convention, right, to take part in this, right? They openly marched, and they're basically being watched by the police, right? And a mob is growing, watching them as they get there. Once they get there, the mayor of New Orleans, Mayor John T. Monroe, who had been, again, one of these notorious Confederate traitors prior to the end of the war, whips up a mob of white supremacists, and in tandem with the New Orleans Police Department, massacre 238 people. And included in those 238 people were 200 African-American war veterans. 40 of those 238 people were actually constitutional delegates. In other words, there were political figures who were tasked with writing the new Constitution, okay? So this gives you an idea of how determined, right, this group of people were to maintain white supremacy, right? This resulted in the federal government. Republicans in DC were outraged by this. And keep in mind, this is a year after the war, and the Union blood, the Republicans, their blood is still hot about the 600,000 Americans who were killed during this war. And they're disgusted to find that these people who, to them, again, in their minds are traitors, have carried out such an atrocity, basically thwarting a democratic process. This gives the radical Republicans the political currency they need to go before Congress, to go into the Senate and declare radical Reconstruction. Radical Reconstruction is a really interesting time period in the history of the United States. It lasts for about 11 years, 1866 to approximately 1877. I'm not going to go into too much of the details of it, but suffice it to know that that massacre, along with a multitude of other atrocities taking place throughout the South, terrorist acts being committed by the Klan and these other terrorist organizations, again, gives the radical Republicans the political support and the political currency to clamp down on the South, right? So a series of acts are passed, the Reconstruction Acts, that allowed the federal government to carve the former Confederate territories up into military districts and basically rule them under martial law and enable those states, right, to put together legislatures, elect governors, right? And basically, it was literally a counter-terrorism operation where you have the federal troops are basically protecting the Black populace and, again, some of the white populace, right, who just wanted straight up democracy. They wanted to be able to vote. They wanted to be able to have their elected representatives meet and pass laws without being massacred. This is a really interesting time period in history, as I said. Then, as now, there were 2 African-American senators in the Senate. We have 2 African-American senators now. They actually came from Mississippi, Hiram Revels and Blanche K. Bruce. There are approximately six representatives in the House of Representatives and Congress, and about 600 state and local legislatures had African-Americans as politicians or were actually predominantly African-American. In this period, 35 African-American politicians were murdered by terrorists. Now, I want you to think about if 11-year period, if between now and 2000 and 2009, imagine if 11 American politicians had been murdered, what kind of backlash that would have, right? But again, this is, they're fighting to try to create, again, this new vision of freedom that Lincoln had spoken of. So one of the things that the 2 things, excuse me, I think I went forward one. Let me see. Sorry, I skipped over one. One of the things that the radical Republicans want to do, and this is the Congress, the Senate, and by 1868, with Ulysses S. Grant as president, all 3 of the branch of government are controlled by the Republican Party. Now, the radical Republicans, I want you to keep in mind, were a faction of the Republican Party. They were not necessarily predominant, but they certainly, again, with the open kind of violence and brutality of these terrorists in the South, they were able to win over other members of the Republican Party, getting them to support legislative moves and changes to the Constitution, in this case, that would, again, make African-American people full citizens, right? Help them to make this transition, right? In terms of the laws of the land, from being property to being human beings, full citizens. So they passed the 14th Amendment in 1868, which basically conferred citizenship upon birth, made all of these freedmen citizens, period, end of story. It nullified the 3/5 clause in the Constitution. This was a clause that had previously had counted enslaved Africans as 3/5 of a human being for purposes of proportional representation. It nullified that, but it also provided for something called equal protection under the law. And that's important because during the Civil Rights era and the Voting Rights Act itself is predicated also upon that notion that everyone deserves equal protection under the law. Another amendment that is added to the Constitution, again, sponsored and pushed through by the radical Republican Congress, was the 15th Amendment, which said the right to vote cannot be withheld because of race or ethnicity. So it's at this moment in 1870 that the Constitution, the United States Constitution, right, has become this document that includes African-American people and includes basically anybody born in this country is a citizen, right, and is protected, right, by this document. But again, these were not people who were giving up easy, right? Um, by 1873, again in Louisiana, which again, Louisiana was always a very difficult place during Reconstruction. But one particular event, which a lot of post-Reconstruction historians used to call it a riot. It's pretty much a misnomer to call this a riot. This was a massacre. On April 13th, 1873, after there was an election in which a county government was predominantly Republican, a group of white supremacist terrorists, basically on horseback, attacked the county courthouse and murdered approximately 150 African Americans. Included 48 who were summarily executed after they surrendered, right? And this was a massacre, right, by this organized terrorist organization in order to remove these individuals from office, right? They did not like the fact that Black Republicans and their allies were in office. And so this was their way of rectifying this situation. In doing this, they also, murdered folks at random who weren't involved in it at all, mutilated bodies and this sort of thing. But it was all about reclaiming white rule, right? Or as they saw it, taking back their state, right? And this is a kind of pattern that we're going to see. You see it in New Orleans at the Constitutional Convention. We see it in the Colfax Massacre. And it's a real test for the federal government in terms of what they're going to do about this. Now, there are a few men who were convicted of this, but their convictions were overturned later on by the Supreme Court based on the premise that the federal government did not have the authority to intervene in such matters. And therefore, it was up to state governments to punish these individuals and to bring them to justice. The notion of what? States' rights, right? And we're going to see how that's going to be something very near and dear to white supremacists. Not only in the South, later on, it's going to spread to other areas, but that is going to be very near and dear in the sense that it creates this blanket opportunity for them to oppress African-American voters and later on other groups of people as well, because they're in the minority, right? Keeping the federal government from intervening to protect their constitutional rights. So radical Reconstruction, this brief period, and I want to emphasize the fact that African Americans were voting in large numbers. African Americans wanted to be involved in the governing of their states and their communities. The radical Republicans and the state governments that were in place during radical Reconstruction, that's why there's public schools in the South. Prior to this period, there were no public schools in the South. Radical Republicans during Reconstruction era said, hey, public schools are a good thing for everybody. Right. And these are the kind of ideas that white supremacists push back against. The idea that somehow, and this is the myth that they're producing in their head, that the tax dollars of hardworking white men are being used to provide these free services for Negroes was totally anathema, was horrifying to them. Furthermore, what was horrifying was the notion of Black people, especially Black men, right? Being in positions of political power, right? But again, that's not to erase this period where Africans did experience this brief flowering of citizenship and leadership and liberty in the South. This ends with the Compromise of 1877. What happens is in the election of 1876, there is a disagreement over the validity of the outcome. There was claims that there was widespread fraud. And it's kind of interesting. I believe it was Senator Ted Cruz was one of these politicians who said, we should look to the election of 1876 as an example of what to do after the recent election, which I think for people who kind of know about that election, this was not even a dog whistle. This was very blatant kind of let's end Reconstruction, basically, because that's what this was about. The Democrats, who again were the party of segregation, pushed back against the election. They threatened not to recognize the new president. So basically, you had these Southern Democrats and kind of moderate, quote unquote, moderate Republicans who kind of went into a back room and hammered out this deal, whereby the Democrats would recognize Rutherford T. Hayes, the Republican, as the president, and in exchange for that, Hayes would promise to withdraw federal troops from policing southern states. In other words, end this counter-terrorist operation that had been going on for 11 years and protecting the African-American people. And they would allow more self-rule, quote unquote, to the southern states. And what you see is this resurgence of the kind of open terrorism that we saw in New Orleans, that we saw in Colfax, Louisiana. And you're going to eventually see the codification of Jim Crow, the introduction of Jim Crow laws once this happened. Because the notion of states' rights posits that the federal government does not get involved, right, in the internal kind of issues of states, right? Particularly the protection of 14th and 15th Amendment rights, that's up to the state government. So if someone has a problem with that, then they appeal to their local authorities. The problem is going to be is that white supremacists are going to stack the deck so that the local authorities are writing the laws and they're the only ones who can be appealed to. So immediately what you begin to see, first of all, you see a wave of terrorism and violence where African Americans are killed or driven out of office. And then once Democrats get their people in office, they begin to change the voting laws. And again, this should sound familiar to you. Grandfather clauses were passed. These were laws that said if your grandfather couldn't vote, then you couldn't vote. Literacy tests were introduced, which were ridiculous. Often the people administering them couldn't pass them. And it didn't matter if you were a Shakespearean scholar, if your skin was black or you were a Negro, you were not going to pass that test. A lack of infrastructure, just not putting polling places in the areas where African Americans lived. Poll taxes, basically forcing people to pay a tax every year if they wanted to vote. If you fell behind on your poll tax, you couldn't vote. And at the end of the day, if all failed, good old-fashioned white supremacist terrorism. Terror was used to stop people from voting. And just again, one of the last of these, and again, there's numerous of these incidents. I could spend this entire lecture just talking about these kinds of incidents where you have bands of white supremacists with terrorists, often organized by terrorist organizations, attacking municipal governments and Black communities and massacring people. There's several. You can do the research on your own. Have a strong stomach when you do it, though, because it can be quite grisly to read about these things. But in Wilmington, North Carolina, on November 10th, 1898, you had a violent mob, and again, in working in conjunction with organized terrorists led by former Confederate officer Alfred Waddell, who basically engaged in a violent overthrow of the city government. Wilmington, North Carolina in 1898 was kind of this holdout amongst the southern municipalities, that their municipal government was still a Republican government. It was a coalition of African American and white Republicans, and this white supremacist mob this had been preceded by months and months of media disinformation and political disinformation, basically in the sense of, really racist caricatures of Black politicians. A lot of the theme of removing Black politicians was that they're going to come after your white women and your white daughters, right? And this is why they want political power, right? And they basically engaged in this and expelled duly elected Black and white Republican politicians, forced some of them to resign at gunpoint, and ran them out of the city and out of the county and took over the city government. Anywhere between 60 and 300 people were murdered when this took place, right? And again, I want you to keep in mind that this is not hush-hush. You see this picture of all these men posing in front of this burnt out municipal building here with their weapons. They're not hiding their crimes. Again, this should look very familiar to us when we think about January 6th, because they expected no repercussions. This is in newspapers all over the country, and the federal government is saying, okay, this is a local matter, right, that the governor and the state legislature has to address. The problem is, the fox was watching the hen house. The legislature and the government, right, were often working in tandem with these folks, and often were in the same terrorist organizations that these people belong to. So again, once you have, by the time you get to the early 1900s throughout the South, there's not a single African American politician any longer, and the creation of state laws is in the hands of these former Confederates, white supremacists, and people who had been terrorists and now are just part of the white power infrastructure. And they begin to pass these various laws. There's a nickname called pig laws, because what they did is they basically made a lot of misdemeanors into felonies, right? And of course, then this is where when you get a felony, you can't vote, sort of thing. And one of them was, if you steal a pig, you get like 5 years in prison. That seems like a lot of time for stealing a pig. But they also passed laws like you can't walk on the railroad tracks after dark. You can't play dice on the city streets and this sort of thing. And these were laws where if you were arrested, you were dragooned into jail by the police. You were brought before a court, a judge in the court system, and often you were in prison and then leased out, right, to individuals involved in industrializing the South and who are just capitalists, kind of investing their capital in various projects throughout the South, right, and using these individuals to basically rebuild the South, to help the South make the transition from this agrarian society to a more industrialized society. And so this happened with the cooperation of the police, the courts, the legislature, and again, these terrorist organizations. Men, women, boys, girls, as you see in this picture, having children, I would say some of these boys are probably 8 or 9 years old, maybe. I would say certainly not, older than that. We're dragooned into the system, and this was kind of this re-enslavement of African Americans that took place. It was part of the legal system. It created a great deal of capital for the Southern elite. And it also was part of this wave of a reinvention of the stereotypes, particularly of Black men. If you look at racist stereotypes of Black men during slavery, is that they were cowardly, they were childish, they were silly, they were drunkards, they were lazy. And some people would say they were loyal, they were kindly, this sort of thing. They loved us like family, this sort of thing, right? After Reconstruction, the stereotype of the African-American man becomes more that he is a criminal, specifically plagued with the disease of wanting to rape white women. This becomes a very powerful trope that's used again to justify this mass criminalization, mass incarceration of African-American men and boys. And so the sociological analysis, right, dictates that there's some type of innate Negro criminality, right? So again, I want you to understand convict labor was important because, for one thing, it marginalized hundreds of thousands, even millions of people probably, and kept them from being involved in the political process. It was a mode of social control, political control, but it also had the added bonus of extremely cheap labor, right? They literally were building bridges, railroads. They helped Birmingham, much of Birmingham's development as a place where steel was they had steel foundries, was initially predicated upon convict labor. So this is kind of a 2 for 3 for white supremacist governments in the South. So again, yeah, as I said, cheaper. This was Southern labor. The social and political control rebuilt the Southern economy, industrialized the South, and most importantly for these folks, it preserved the white power structure. This is a very brutal system. And I don't put these pictures in to shock people. I put them in because I think people often need to see this to really understand it. It's almost hard to believe unless you see it. You have that other picture of those little boys out there working. And here you have a man who's being punished, right? Tied up in this very excruciatingly painful position. And even when there's a great documentary called Slavery by Another Name, and I encourage you, if you're interested in this topic, to watch it, because there's some great quotes from the individuals who wrote about this period, who are employing this labor. I remember this one quote, I'll never forget it, where a man says, Negro convict labor is just, it's a really effective form of labor as long as you have someone in control who understands Negroes. Right? That's exactly what he says, right? And actually, in fact, he didn't say someone in control. He said an overseer, right? So they knew what they were about. They were trying to recreate the system of slavery and at the same time preserve the white power structure and again keep African Americans from voting. So I'm going to fast forward. By World War II, convict labor system had for the most part formally ended. You still had, and I'd say to this day, you still have some semblance of it. If you ever want to Google a picture of Angola State Prison in Louisiana, it looks like a plantation, actually. But formally, in the way in which it existed prior to World War II, it does not anymore after World War II. And also another thing that had happened in this period, I'm not going to go into in great detail, was the Great Migration, which starts to take place around 1898, 1900s, where you have millions, eventually 6 million African Americans leave the South for northern cities. What's kind of interesting is prior to that, many of these southern states, the vast majority of people in them, I think South Carolina was like 65% African American before the Great Migration, didn't have a single African American politician from that state. But with the beginning of the modern civil rights era, the passing of Brown versus Board of Education, you're going to begin to see African Americans not only push back, but fight voraciously, right, for civil rights. Brown versus Board of Education, of course, is a landmark 1954 Supreme Court decision, which overturned an earlier decision, Plessy versus Ferguson of 1896, that said that this idea of separate but equal, that African Americans could be separated from whites as long as the facilities were equal. The problem was the facilities were never equal, and the separation was about power. And so the Supreme Court recognized this and overturned this. And this kind of was this is the beginning of African Americans on the ground beginning to desegregate and demand, not just desegregate public places, but demand and fight for political power. And because Southern states didn't all of a sudden just say, oh, well, the Supreme Court said it, I guess we got to do it. It took another almost 20 years and scores of people dying, being murdered by terrorists in order for this system of Jim Crow and racial apartheid, blatant racial apartheid, to be brought down. So Southern resistance was there from the very, very beginning. And so I want to look at what politicians are doing here. A very visible articulation of white Southern resistance to Brown versus Board of Education and to African Americans organizing for their rights was the Southern Manifesto, which was issued in March of 1956 on the floor of Congress by Howard Smith, chairman of the House Rules Committee, a Virginia congressional representative. And basically what he did was he introduced the Southern Manifesto, which he said was a declaration of constitutional principles. 82 congressional representatives and 19 senators signed on to this. They were all from former Confederate states, and they all vowed to undermine Brown versus Board of Education, and they swore to uphold white supremacy as it stood in the Southern states. And this is where you begin to see, this is a great picture from this period. You have this very irresponsible white man with the sign says, "We want a white school." He should be ashamed of himself. And the youngsters there carrying the segregationist flag. I don't like to call it the Confederate flag, first because it wasn't, and second, it wasn't really a popular flag until this era. It was meant as a symbol in opposition, right, to the eradication of white supremacy in the South. And in the South, what you had by then is this solid block of Democratic politicians that were known as the Dixiecrats. And the Dixiecrats organized themselves as a bloc in the Senate and in Congress to block any legislation, to try to block any legislation that was about eradicating white supremacy in the South and giving equal rights or voting rights or any type of rights to African Americans. One of the things that local politicians and businessmen and noted white members of the community did throughout the South were set up these white Senate citizen councils, which basically sold themselves as kind of a public relations civic organization that was trying to convince the country that segregation was good for the South and the condition of African Americans was actually not bad. But they also collected intelligence. They used private investigators, former policemen, current policemen to collect intelligence on individuals who were involved in the civil rights movement or were sympathetic to the civil rights movement, and fed that information to the Ku Klux Klan terrorists, who often used it to murder, maim, and bomb individuals. So there's this post-Brown versus Board resurgence of the Ku Klux Klan. They'd been around since, 1865, when they were founded by Nathan Bedford Forrest, a former Confederate officer. They kind of went into decline after Reconstruction. They kind of became legitimate, were part of the government. But after Brown versus Board of Education, they reemerge quite powerfully. And I'm sorry, I left out the fact that Birth of a Nation, when that came out in 1912, I believe it was, also saw not only a rebirth of the Klan, but the Klan spread throughout the entire nation. You had Klan chapters in Michigan and Vermont, for God's sakes. I don't know, you can't get more Yankee than Vermont. I don't know why they had Klan up there, but white supremacy is universal, and it's a hell of a drug. But anyway, the Dixiecrats and the Southern Democrats are also connected to the COINTELPRO program, a program by the FBI that targeted civil rights figures, specifically Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, Fred Hampton, and others. And they were also connected, again, as I said, to murders, bombings, and arsons targeted against African Americans, civil rights workers, white and black, all throughout this period. And just to give you some idea of the level of violence, I chose Birmingham, Alabama, for which the statistics are readily available. And I think a great case study in just the savagery and brutality of white supremacist terrorism in this period. There were approximately 50 bombings in a 20-year period in Birmingham, Alabama, that targeted African-American homes, businesses, and yes, churches. In addition to this, there were extremely brutal displays of violence by the Birmingham police against nonviolent protesters, sicking dogs on them, fire hosing them. And this is like, nice little old ladies coming from church and this sort of thing, young people as young as 12 and 13 years old. The Southern Christian Leadership Conference attempted a campaign of nonviolent resistance in Birmingham, Alabama. They were quite resilient, quite determined throughout this period in this campaign. And I think this campaign of violence by these terrorists culminates with the September 15th, 1963 bombing of a church in Birmingham. This is horrific for a lot of people because they specifically targeted the Sunday school, right? And so 4 little girls were murdered. And so this was just a horrific thing. Even racist white people in the North was like, this is beyond the pale, right? Sort of thing. This gives you an idea of the level of violence and the level of determination that white supremacists in the South were showing towards keeping African Americans from exercising political power. And it's something that I always like to really get through to my students, that it wasn't about just integrating buses and lunch counters. It was about stopping terrorists. It was about being able to, vote and exercise your right as a citizen, to have some say in how you are governed, right? Which is theoretically the principle upon which the republic is supposed to be based on. And so voting rights. So the 1965 voting rights bill came about after the Selma, Alabama campaign. Alabama has a really terrible track record. It's not surprising that Senator, I believe Tuberville is his name, is one of these extremists in the Senate who kind of was part of that that attack basically on the Capitol that took place January 6th, because historically there's been this pattern with them as being extremely resistant to sharing power with African Americans. Basically, the Selma campaign was a campaign to register African American voters, had been going on some time, when in February 26, after a night march, a young man by the name of Jimmy Lee Jackson was murdered. He was shot in his back, trying basically to protect his elderly parents who were being beaten by the Alabama State Police. This again, and so often these people, they're their own worst enemy, because an act like that did not frighten people. People were no longer frightened. In fact, black people as well as white people came to Alabama, came to Selma, right, because of this, to take part in this resistance. So on March 7th, a group of activists, including the late John Lewis, who was a young man at the time, decided that they were going to begin a march from Selma, Alabama to Montgomery, Alabama, to basically register. It was a voting rights march. It was kind of a demonstration, somewhat theatrical, but the purpose was to get there and register to vote, right? And as they were approaching a bridge named the Edmund Pettus Bridge, a group of state police, local police, county sheriffs, recently deputized citizens, right, which probably meant they were members of some terrorist organization or another, met them on the bridge, attacked them with tear gas, billy clubs, dogs, whips, and just beat them senseless. And these were people who, if you ever want to go on YouTube and watch the footage, it's quite bizarre in a sense. These are people who walk right out of a church service in their Sunday best, walking the way very peacefully, very orderly towards the bridge. And this mob of policemen just attacked them like, it's a very savage display. The interesting thing about it is there were only 3 news networks back then. And they believe all 3 of them interrupted their regularly scheduled programming to show this live. And one network, I want to say it was CBS, was showing a movie called Judgment at Nuremberg, which was about the Nuremberg trials, right? And the historical irony of that could not have been lost upon the viewers. March 9th, a couple days after, when Martin Luther King and others came to Selma to support this, and even Malcolm X came to Selma during this period. March 9th, King led a symbolic march to the bridge, but then turned everyone around and they went back to the church. That night, a white man, a Unitarian minister from Boston, who'd come there to support the civil rights workers, was murdered by a group of white thugs because he was walking out at night. I'm from Massachusetts, so the man probably had a Boston accent. They knew he was with the civil rights workers, and so they beat him to death. Again, this did not have the impact. This did not have the effect that these folks hoped it would. In fact, LBJ, President Johnson, who had been very reluctant to sign any kind of voting rights legislation, he was afraid of alienating his fellow Southern Democrats and splitting the party. After this event, there's such a public outcry against this kind of brutal behavior, by government officials, that he actually went on TV. He went on TV in a speech on March 15th and said, quote, "There is no Negro problem. There is no Southern problem. There's no Northern problem. There's only an American problem. Their cause must be our cause too, because it is not just Negroes, but really it is all of us who must overcome the crippling legacy of bigotry and injustice. And we shall overcome," unquote. So that was a huge thing for the civil rights movement, right? You have a president, the highest office in the land, who basically is he's basically saying, if you send me the legislation, I'm going to sign it, right? So this is kind of the beginning of the end, I would say. This is the twilight of the Jim Crow era, where you have this blatant kind of suppression, blatant brutal displays in order to suppress voting. They're going to fall by the wayside. So the 1965 Voting Rights Act really is the fruit of the Selma Campaign. On August 6, 1965, the act is signed. The section, I'm going to go into the whole thing. If you want to look up the verbiage, by all means do. I'm paraphrasing because we're not lawyers here. But Section 2 basically said the federal government is going to enforce the 15th Amendment, and it also outlawed literacy tests specifically, right? Section 4 was an important section, because Section 4 basically talked about how to determine who are the historical offenders in terms of trying to keep African Americans from voting. And within Section 4, there's Section B that had a formula for determining who those people were. And it should be obvious, it's like, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana, Texas. We know who the states were, right? And basically, Section 5 said that if you were a historical offender, right, any changes in voting laws were prohibited, right, without pre-clearance by the Department of Justice in Washington. And it also allowed for federal monitors, right, to oversee voting to ensure that there was not intimidation and this sort of thing. And again, I want you to remember the history that I've been talking about, right? This history of violence and passing laws and all of these ways of keeping African Americans from voting. So the idea was that the federal government was now going to keep an eye on these folks so they wouldn't try to pull nothing, right? And it actually was somewhat effective. What probably hurt was that as African Americans were more able to vote, turnout rates were about the same as white Americans, which aren't really that great in this country. I think if we crack 60%, that's considered good, right? Whereas if I don't know the exact number, but during the Reconstruction period, African Americans were probably voting at like 80, 70%. I mean, it was something they really wanted to do and understood the importance of it. You still had things, though, like the felony laws, right? Where if you'd committed a felony, you could not vote, but you did not have these grandfather clauses, these literacy tests, poll taxes, etc. So 1965, the Voting Rights Act is passed. The Democratic Party is in disarray by the time you get to 68. In particular, the Southern Democrats are not really happy with the extent to which the Democratic Party has, for its own political purposes, let's be clear, embrace the civil rights movement. And so Richard Nixon is the first Republican candidate to kind of pick up on that. In 1968, Nixon runs for president using the slogan, he's going to restore law and order. And he keeps saying law and order. That's his answer to everything, right? And remember, this is the year that King was assassinated, right? This was a year that there were numerous protests against the Vietnam War, right? There were riots in cities and African-American, in cities where there were African Americans were involved in the riots against police brutality and this sort of thing. And his answer to all of that was law and order, right? And he also said that maybe we need to stop talking about civil rights so much and talk about people just obeying the law, right? And what he was doing is what they call dog whistle politics. He's basically using this kind of coded language because he wants to get that Southern vote because he knows they're ripe for the picking, right? Much like right now, anti-Trump Republicans are ripe for the picking for the Democratic Party. So he saw this opening and this becomes called the Southern strategy. The Republican Party will intentionally use the kind of language that is not really so coded, right? White racists understand exactly what's being said, and Black people do too, right? Reagan takes this to a whole nother level, Ronald Reagan. In 1980, when he declared his candidacy for the presidency, he actually went to a place called Philadelphia, Mississippi, right? To declare his candidacy. And he spent a lot of his talk, his speech that he gave talked about states' rights. And I want a little history about Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. This was a place, Philadelphia, Mississippi, my apologies to Pennsylvania. Philadelphia, Mississippi was a small town where in 1964, 3 civil rights workers were kidnapped by the local sheriff's department, taken out into the woods, beaten to death, and at least one of them was shot in the head, and then they were buried, right? So this was a hotbed of white supremacism. This is a hotbed of segregationists, and this is where he went to announce his presidency, right? And again, begins to push this idea of states' rights, begins to kind of racialize welfare, even though the vast majority of people on welfare were, white people, kind of creating this image of the welfare queen and the strapping buck, right? Who's totally able to work, but sitting on his butt and getting welfare checks, right? Kind of playing into white grievance politics. Now, Was Reagan a racist? Well, he used the N-word, so yeah, he was a racist. But he was not a white supremacist in the sense that he wanted to recreate some kind of apartheid system in the South. I think the Republican Party began to cynically use this issue, right, to get these voters to kind of play on their grievances. Ultimately, it cannibalizes the entire party. Another thing that Reagan did, and later on, you have to give credit where credit is due. Clinton did this to kind of take the issue away from the Republicans, was to racialize crime, right? The whole issue of cocaine, the problem of cocaine in the 80s and in the 90s becomes linked to Black communities, right? As if Black people are bringing the cocaine into the communities, right? Turns out to be, of course, the absolute opposite later on. By the time you get to the phenomenon of Trumpism, right, this racial grievance, right, that had been used as an exploitive tool to court the Southern vote has literally taken over the party. And this is what you saw the other day at the Capitol, but we'll come back to that. But how did we end up with this gutting of the Voting Rights Act, right? Because without that, Trump wouldn't have been president, right, in 2016, right? Without that, you would not have people standing 8 hours in line during a pandemic in 2020 in Georgia to be able to vote, right? And what this was is, again, the Republicans are winning elections and they're using white grievance as a tool. I'm not saying that was their entire platform, but that particular demographic of voters would push them over the top. They were almost guaranteed all of the former Southern states because they were relying upon this issue of white grievance. So you have the 5 Supreme Court justices who actually gut the Voting Rights Act were all Republican United States Supreme Court appointees. Anton Scalia was appointed in 1986 by Reagan, Anthony Kennedy also by Reagan, Clarence Thomas in 1991. He was confirmed after a pretty bizarre confirmation hearing in which he was clearly had committed acts which one would think was beneath the dignity of a Supreme Court justice, yet he was still confirmed. And this is under George Bush the first, and then George Bush the second got both John Roberts confirmed as the Chief Justice of the court and Samuel Alito confirmed as a justice as well. And so when Shelby versus Holder is brought before the court in 2013, it is a case that was brought before the court by Shelby County, Alabama, and their argument was that Section 5, right, that said that the federal government had a right and had an interest in ensuring that historical offenders, right, of the voting rights of African Americans should get pre-clearance. They're saying that this is unconstitutional and that it violates the 10th Amendment and other amendments in terms of interfering in the rights of state governments to run their own affairs. And it's basically a states' rights argument, right? And they also said Section 4, right, that this was also unfair, right, to again say that these folks were historical offenders because things have changed. Look, there's a Black president now, right, sort of thing. And so they especially want to erase Section 4, specifically 4B, which came up with the formula to enforce Section 5. Now, the decision that comes down is not cut and dried. Although Thomas and Scalia wanted to toss out Section 5, it doesn't get tossed out. It's a 5-4 decision. Section 5 is upheld, but Section 4B is struck down, right? So what that means is that the formula that was used, the specific formula to determine, right, those states that had a historical pattern of thwarting the right of African Americans to vote was unconstitutional, that it was out of date, and that those social and cultural conditions didn't exist anymore. To me, it was kind of this argument is, look, we got a Black man in the White House, we're post-racial, this is no longer relevant, it's no longer needed, men of goodwill will do the right thing. But as soon as this happened throughout the southern states and many northern states and places like Arizona, which isn't northern, it's southwest, but in other states, you had a flurry of laws designed to make it more difficult for folks to vote. Just to give you an example, thousands of voter precinct stations were shut down, especially in predominantly African American areas. They would pass voter ID laws. This is a particular event which you go on. They'd pass voter ID laws where you needed a voter ID to vote. And then they would shut down motor vehicle centers in the areas where there were predominantly Black people and and a lot of times an area wasn't a lot of infrastructure in terms of public transportation. So it's because of voter suppression, right, that you begin to see, again, if you look at 2016, you have to, again, place responsibility where it belongs. Black voter turnout wasn't great, but also there had been a lot of laws passed, right, that made it more difficult for African Americans to vote. And really the most evident fruit of Shelby was the 2018 gubernatorial race in Georgia between Stacey Abrams and Governor Kemp, the one who won the election, where voter suppression was rife. And not only was there voter for suppression, there were things like, and this is another thing that happens in these areas since the Shelby versus Holder was passed, was that the state election officials, if generally these are Republicans, there haven't been any Democrats I know of doing this, will just purge voter rolls. In other words, they will unregister hundreds of thousands of people saying, well, we haven't heard from them in a while. They haven't voted, so we're going to remove their registration, right? And so people would show up to vote, find out they couldn't vote. They, again, closing down precincts. In fact, with the Georgia race in particular, there was a power outage in Atlanta, right, which caused people to wait like 8-12 hours in line to vote. So, Stacey Abrams, brilliant individual, had been in the state legislature for many years, was a very strong candidate, barely loses the election. But she conceded. She said, well, she didn't concede. She says, I'm going to recognize that I did not win this, but I'm not going to concede because clearly something was rotten in Denmark with this, right? So in 2019, she immediately begins an organization known as Fair Fight. And it's basically a grassroots voting rights activist based organization, and really is responsible for the Democratic Party turning Georgia blue in 2020 and also winning the Senate. They both senators and the presidency, which is kind of unprecedented. I don't think that's happened in Georgia since 76. And so she really provides a model for us. And again, now I'm going to move on to more prescriptive measures of what we can do, of how we need to move forward in dealing with the current situation. What we need now, really, I would argue, and this is opinion, and this is based on history, is we need a multi-pronged attack. And yes, I do use the term attack because almost in terms of the political environment, we're in 1963 again, if not 1866. We're seeing the rise of a neo-fascist movement, kind of married to a traditional white supremacist American movement. We definitely need a new Voting Rights Act, right, to be passed in the legislature, and that's why all this nonsense about bipartisanship and reaching across the table is just that nonsense. The Republican Party does not want a Voting Rights Act. Well, I would say the vast majority of them do not. If more people vote, they don't win elections. They literally have said that. We need an aggressive confrontation against domestic terrorism, specifically white supremacist domestic terrorism. This has never happened really in this country. The Ku Klux Klan is the oldest terrorist organization in the Americas, for God's sakes, right? They've killed more Americans than Al-Qaeda and ISIS put together. There's no way Al-Qaeda and ISIS could ever take over the government of the United States. The Ku Klux Klan has elected senators, congressmen, governors, and have been responsible for the murder of thousands of people and may be the responsible for the destruction of democracy. They're absolutely an existential threat to the United States of America, and they must be confronted. And the same with these neo-fascist movements that are coming out. They should be called a spade. Should be called a spade. There should not be any other sidism with fascism, right? You know, you stop fascism the way we stopped it before. We invaded France. We killed a lot of them, right? I mean, I'm not saying go out in the streets and engage in like some kind of vigilante violence, but I'm saying fascism cannot be, reasoned with. And so we need to aggressively confront this, marginalize these people, and defang them. And lastly, I say this, and we need to create revolutionary infrastructures. And I guess, what is that? Remember, the Democratic Party was once the party of blatant white supremacy, and they could be that once again. And this is not a crack against them. What I'm saying is that I'm not sure either party has ever really historically had the best interest of African American people in their survival as a priority, and therefore African American people and their co-conspirators, white and brown, whatever, right, need to have institutional infrastructure, right, that protects them against, right, and does not leave them at the mercy of these politicians who act predominantly in their own self-interest, right? And and that means like ways to exercise political power. That means getting people registered to vote and getting them to the polls. That means holding politicians' feet to the fire with a seriousness, right? And that says we're not going to have it. And lastly, we need to recognize that we need to be prepared to defend our communities and ourselves, right? Because the police and the government are not always going to do that. And again, I can give you, I've given you 3 instances. There are scores more where they did not, right? And where hundreds of African Americans died. For God's sakes, this happened to Mexican Americans, right? Along the border with Texas, right? Where you had law enforcement and so-called vigilantes, I call them terrorists, massacring people. So revolutionary infrastructure is about self-reliance, resourcefulness, kind of a sense of autonomy outside of the political United States power structure. Even if you want to engage that power structure, you should still have some kind of autonomy outside of that. And I think global connectivity, working with like-minded individuals globally who are against this global rise of fascism. Martin Luther King, Marcus Garvey, Malcolm X, Ella Baker, Fannie Lou Hamer, all of them knew this. All of them understood these things, right? We need to listen to what our elders were telling us. So lastly, January 6, 2021. This was basically the historical continuity of white supremacy. And this is a great photograph. You have this Trump flag with a skull and crossbones and a noose. And I want to remind, for some of you who might know a little bit about the culture of white supremacists, is a very popular novel that these intellectually stunted individuals enjoyed called the Turner Diaries. And there's an event in this novel where there's something called the Day of the Rope, and that's when the white supremacists come to power and they spend the day hanging all these politicians and mulattoes, quote unquote, and race traders and this sort of thing. And so this imagery is right in line with that, as well as, again, we know the Klan has a kind of history and a kind of fetishism with lynchings and mutilations of Black bodies. But January 6th, I want to emphasize, has happened many times over in the past in southern states after and during Reconstruction. Scores of African Americans and their co-conspirators, white or otherwise, were murdered by semi-organized mobs of white supremacist terrorists in the hundreds, right? January 6th is unique only in the sense that it was unsuccessful and that it was an attack on DC, right? Which even the Confederate Army was never able to do, interestingly enough. it's important for us to understand, however much it makes us uncomfortable, white supremacy was the foundation of this republic. It continues and will continue to reassert itself in the face of attempts by African Americans to demand the quote natural rights unquote the Enlightenment era philosophers talked about, yet intended only for white people, right? And it will continue to do so, right, until it is ruthlessly confronted, rooted out, crushed, and destroyed once and for all, right? And the question for all of us, right, but particularly people of color, because Trump started his campaign. What did he do? He called Mexican men rapists, right? That is so tired and old. If he'd have placed it with Negro, it would have fit in with the 19th century, right? So white supremacy is bad, and it's bad for white people too. And that's another lecture. White supremacy is bad for the republic, right? And if it is not confronted, it is not destroyed, it's going to destroy this republic. So we have to ask ourselves, what are we prepared to do? What sort of future do we want? And our white co-conspirators have to be like, they have to be firmly committed to they don't want this, and recognizing this is bad for humanity. This is bad to the republic. This is bad for my soul. And that's it. That's all I have for you today. I'm sorry if I got a little bit too passionate towards the end, but this project really brought something out in me. So any questions?
I have a question.
Yes. Hi, Pam.
Hi.
How you doing?
I'm good. How are you?
Good.
Excellent lecture. Thank you. That was really informative, and I learned a lot. Thank you.
Yeah.
I have a question about your thoughts on the census and what role that's going to play, because I remember the anxiety of thinking that Republicans were going to hold office during redistricting. Now, we could argue easily that during the census, the count is off, just given kind of similar tactics that you presented within your lecture. Do you see any, I don't want to say hopes, but some righting of the ship, being that now we're in a point of redistricting, and we're in a point of appointing legislators based on populace. What's your thoughts on that going forward?
Well, there is some good news. From what I understand, one of the things that Biden immediately did was he kind of threw out that nonsensical notion that we're not going to count people if we think that they're undocumented, quote unquote. Right. So that's a step in the right direction. In terms of redistricting, I actually was reading an article about this morning. The Republican Party is committed to gerrymandering. They're committed to it. They're not going to give that up. So you cannot compromise with them right now. My position is that we got 51-50, right, in the Senate. They need to push forward, right, with legislation that's gonna address those issues, specifically gerrymandering, voting rights, etc. So I think we're not out of the woods, obviously, but I think obviously the fact that this man did not get elected, it's good for those areas, right, where he was intending on applying that litmus test, which really was designed to frighten people into not cooperating with the census. People who he didn't want counted, specifically brown people, specifically Latinos, to be honest with you.
Thank you.
You're welcome, Pam.
Good afternoon, sir. Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Oh, you can go ahead. Go for it.
Who am I speaking to? Hi, Yasmin.
Oh, hey, what's up? Okay, I'll go ahead and go.
Okay.
So I had a question with regards to, I guess more of a question of pedagogy. But I mean, how does one really implement this kind of, I mean, for lack of a better term, history? Because I mean, yeah, it can absolutely be embedded within U.S. history. And while I recognize that it's not really our responsibility as a community to, I mean, teach these complicated, complex things to our fellow citizens. I mean, how do we, I don't know, how do we I don't even know what I'm trying to say here. How
I
do we
think I know what
avoid
you're
stuff
saying.
like this? Yeah.
Yeah. I think I know what you're saying. I think, and correct me if I'm wrong.
Sure.
I think so. So here's the thing. Yeah, we're historians. We're in the classroom. We have an obligation to teach them how to think critically. We give them the raw materials of history, and then we talk about these things, and we come to kind of a synthesis. But out in the public, how do we act? Yeah, I mean, I think it's hard to educate the public, quote unquote. A lot of the public doesn't want to be educated. So I think we need to act in accordance with our understanding of the history in tandem with other people who also understand the historical urgency of the moment. Do you get what I'm saying?
Yes. And
Yeah.
as a follow-up to that, I mean, how does one really, oh my God, I keep getting it and then it just leaves
It's
my
okay.
brain. I mean, come back to me. I will come back.
Okay, Jasmine. Sorry. No worries. Did I have another question there?
Okay, I think I got it.
You got it? Okay, because no one's jumping in.
So how do you like address, because what we usually work with students in US history is they have a tendency to have a certain narrative already.
Yeah.
And so how do you like reverse that without it sounding like it's some sort of conspiracy theory, you know what I mean?
Yeah. No, I totally know what you mean. I started my teaching career in Connecticut and upstate New York. So, and I'm an older gentleman, so I'm used to this, you know.
Right.
Yeah. So I found that people believe things much more readily, or they accept them much more readily when you give them primary sources.
Mhm.
And as much as I dislike to do it, I don't like displaying broken black bodies, you know, and
Mhm.
lynchings and this sort of thing. But I will show pictures of this so they know that I am not exaggerating, right? But I also will give them this, you know, the data, the statistics. Yeah, Tulsa existed. Black Wall Street existed. Here's the pictures of it being dismantled. It doesn't exist anymore, right? Here are the geologists who are using sonic technology to look for mass graves, right? So you can't be accused of indoctrinating them like the nuts are saying we're doing, as if we could anyway, right? I could barely get them to read the chapter. But what you are doing is you're giving the raw materials of history, and they have to roll with it. They got to discern. They got to decide: is this brutal? Is this unjust? I try not to even use value-laden language. I just try to give them those primary sources embedded in a lecture, right, which is encouraging them to synthesize it all together, and then, you know, for lack of a better word, kind of regurgitate something intelligent, right? Some kind of analysis of it. Do you know what I mean?
Yes.
And that's how we escape this charge of indoctrinating people, which is such a silly charge. I've never met a historian who wanted to, and I've definitely never met one who was successful at it.
Yeah, right.
I can barely get my daughter to wash the dishes if I wanted to, right? Get my son to make his bed, right? And indoctrinate total strangers. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that.
No problem. Were there any more questions? I'm sorry, go ahead. I mean to...
You've got a strong third party. Would that help? What do you suggest about that? People that talk about
Did you say a third party, Eric?
Third party, yes.
Yeah, that's a great question. Right now, I'm being Machiavellian a little bit. Let's encourage the people on the right to do that. Because I think right now the threat is so, I don't think I'm going overboard when I say the threat is so profound from the far right now. This is a serious threat that we're facing. This is a little unprecedented, right? With the exception of the Civil War. So I think right now we need to all be Antifa. You know, we all need to be anti-fascist. I don't know how that became a bad word to be anti-fascist. You know, the 82nd Airborne, 101st, and the 1st Infantry Division were anti-fascists. Right now, we need to be about anti-fascism. We need to stop this onslaught. I think developing a third party, it might not be a bad idea to move in that direction in terms of being able to hold the Democrats' feet to the fire. The problem is once you have a political party, man, it just gets, everything gets all cynical. I feel like, you know what I mean? Politicians are so self-interested, and so a lot of work you get done with them is appealing to their self-interest. You know, like do it or we're gonna, we're gonna take you out of office, kind of thing. Yeah.
Well, we're kind of seeing that right now with the right wing. I mean, all of the sort of classical conservatives are fleeing the Republican Party,
Absolutely.
and
Yeah.
so it's a dissolution of the vote. If you want to be optimistic about it, because it's all they're doing is dissoluting the Republican vote, right? If they jump ship and start voting independent. So we might see a split of the party like the Whigs did back in the day.
Yeah.
There's something, I'm waiting to see how that plays out.
I wish Donald Trump all the luck in the world with the Patriot Party. I hope he's very successful.
Looks like someone has a question in the comments.
Okay. I'm sorry. Let me look.
Lindsay asks, what are your views of how these topics are discussed within grade school books? Because I remember that they spoke on Malcolm X as an extremist or bad views on him when he was trying to make his point. And then there's a follow-up question, but
yeah, that's a great question.
Yeah.
First, I would say it's very important. Yeah, I grew up in a Pan-African house. My father was a Pan-Africanist. My parents were converts to Islam within the context of being Pan-Africanist. And Malcolm X we loved that man. He was a great. So when I heard that stuff in school, I mean, my dad told me before I even left the house, don't believe nothing they say. Come home, read the books we got. The fact is, what they're doing in grade school isn't really teaching you history. It's social studies. They're indoctrinating you. They're teaching you how to be a civic minded, American cheerleader in a sense. So I would say that, it would be nice if we could reform that somehow. I'm one of the few people you hear, probably who would say that I'm more in favor of more localized control of education, with a kind of national standard, in terms of literacy and science and math or whatever. But I certainly think that, as long as, when you think about even where most textbooks are written to satisfy the California and the Texas markets, because they're the largest markets. So you're going to get, it's a very politicized process. So you're going to get a version of so-called history, quote unquote. It's not history. It's just a series of myths, topped off with some kind of civic pride. In terms of making the Black Lives Matter movement a political one, well, they're making the Black Lives Matter movement a political topic because it's frightening. Whenever African Americans get together in an organized fashion and demand that folks stop killing them, right? This becomes controversial. What's amazing about the Black Lives Matter movement, somewhat amazing but predictable, is the accusation that they're terrorists and they're rabble-rousing troublemakers. They're much less benign than the Black Panther Party, who weren't terrorists either, right? They don't advocate defending yourself with a gun or arming yourself or this sort of thing. But I think that anytime, this is almost kind of a knee-jerk reaction, within the United States. The white supremacy always reasserts itself that whenever African American people say, "Hey, enough already. We're going to assert our humanity," the pushback is very violent, and it's way over the top, right? You had people coming out with semi-automatic rifles and body armor to confront Black Lives Matter people who, in my estimate, I got mad respect for them, could be a little bit more militant, but who are clearly, this is nonviolent confrontation. But that's kind of the pattern. If you look back at if we look at, again, I'm giving a talk on King next week. One of the things about King is King talked about loving his enemies. He was all about nonviolence, no matter what was done to him. But people hated him. People were so terrified of him. And I think it's similar with the Black Lives Matter movement. That's how white supremacy works in this society. Somebody said, do you think the Democrats should pack the Supreme Court? If so, and will that actually help us? I feel like everything's on the table right now. I mean, again, we are battling. The Republican Party has gone off the rails, right? You had the Arizona Republican Party actually trying to put forth a law that if they don't like the vote for president in their state, that they can nullify that vote, right? So you have a very anti-democratic, fascistic element coming to the fore in the Republican Party. If stacking the Supreme Court is what it takes, and that's what we need to do. I wouldn't start with that. I think right now they need to push through the coronavirus package. They need to push through a voting rights package, right? That specifically addresses the issue of gerrymandering. Let's just start there. I have to say, but again, then there is the issue that, and I'm just going to keep this real. With the Supreme Court as it is now, I think Roe v. Wade is going to be overturned. And that's a huge concern. I mean, we're going to go back to some dark times where you're going to have, and you're going to have to go to a different state or do something even more drastic. So Roe v. Wade, there might be some other things down the pipe. I think one of the things I believe Roosevelt held the threat of packing the court when the court was like murmuring that they were going to overturn his New Deal. And so I think the court should be put on notice that if you start, doing stuff that's not cool, we'll pack the court. We'll pass these bills and we'll pack the court. That's just my opinion, though, and not a well thought out one. So if what happened at the Capitol, I'm sorry, go ahead. Does somebody have a question?
No, I was going to read the chat, but go ahead. You're already reading it.
Oh, if what happened at the Capitol on January 6th with a Black Lives Matter movement, I think it would have been a massacre. I think you were 100% right. Why do you think the Capitol handled it a lot different than what happens because they were white people. That's why. It was their cousins and such. I'm being facetious, but I'm also keeping it real. I mean, some of those policemen paused and took selfies with these guys. Some of them let them in. There were congressmen who were texting them where Nancy Pelosi was. I mean, if nothing else, January 6th should be very stark and clear that there are two types of policing in this country, one for Black and brown people and one for white people. Again, think about the fact I'm an African-American Muslim, right? Can you imagine if I said I'm going to start a Muslim militia and I started recruiting other Muslims and we started walking around with armored vests on and semi-automatic rifles, right? Like the Oath Keepers and the 3%ers. It's very obvious why. I wouldn't do it because it's idiotic, but also it's very obvious why there would be a very different response for me if I did that. And yes, it is completely about race. And it's unfortunate that even some of our so-called allies will say, well, let's not jump the gun and say this is about race, when 90% of the time when someone says that, it is about race. It's just that people are kind of uncomfortable with discussing that. Okay, so I guess I'll read these questions. Why did the attack on the Capitol happen? Well, I'm gonna go into that too deep. I mean, basically it was, Trump has gathered this following around him of people who are quite extreme and feel a great deal of violent animosity towards the federal government and towards mostly non-white people. When he lost the election, he perpetrated the lie that there was cheating, that cheating had gone on. He also perpetrated the lie that somehow the vice president could reverse the election. And he encouraged them to attack the Capitol in order to intimidate the Congress and the Senate and the vice president, although he didn't have the authority to not certify the vote. So, I mean, that's the best answer I can give to that without launching into a whole lesson. I think a lot of what went on was about Trump trying to maintain his power within the Republican Party, also to raise money for his super PAC that he has set up, and also to help defend himself against the many criminal trials that he's going to be facing now that he's out of office. Is there a common ground on which the working class can work together? Absolutely. White supremacy has always been about keeping blacks, white, brown, Asian people of the working class from coming together and challenging the elite. The common ground that we can all agree on is, I think, first of all, we kind of want a democracy. We want to preserve it. We want fairness within that democracy. And we all want an equal opportunity to things like education, jobs, and we want to be free of discrimination. We want to not have the wealth, channeled to the top, 0.001% of the population. I think there's a lot of common ground, but we have to get through the fog of all the issues that the elites place in front of us to keep us separated. And that's hard to do, with all due respect, with working class white people, because of the reality of white privilege, which for working class white people especially, and poor white people especially, there's not a lot of benefits to it. It's more psychological than anything, but it's very powerful, and it's hard to bridge that gap, but I think that it can be bridged. The common ground is that we're destroying our society. We're creating vast inequities in wealth. We're destroying our representational government, and that's good for working class people. And we need to come together to stop this. How could we as a community reach more people of African American history? Oh man, again, I think just in how we live our life and how we have conversations with our family and our friends, I think is the best way. The way I do it is I'm a teacher. That's why I became a teacher. Somebody asked about Muslims not be allowed to take an oath of office and putting their hands on the Quran. Is that true? Wait, I'm not sure I understand that question. And I'm not a Muslim scholar, so I don't feel comfortable answering it. It is so true that I know that Keith Ellison is a Muslim congressman, and he swore his oath of office on a Quran. So I don't know the answer to that question. Dr. Corey, walaikum salam. I mean, okay, cool. Are there any other questions?
Thank you so much. Thank you everyone for attending. In the chat, there is a survey for us to do, if you could do that. And then Tiffany, did you have any parting words for us before we go?
Yes, I have a one small surprise giveaway for specifically a student. So I have a question to ask, and the first student to write in the chat, I'll go ahead and send you a link to claim your prize. So the question is, what was the Selma campaign established for? And you can go ahead and put that in the chat, and whoever, okay, so Natalie M. So Natalie M, I'm going to go ahead and send me your email in a private message. Thank you so much. But I don't have any parting words other than thank you so much for joining. Thank you, Dr. Dphrepoulezz, for your wonderful lecture. I know everybody definitely learned a lot. So thank you. And I hope you guys can join us for the rest of the month's events. Tomorrow we will have a virtual Black Wall Street workshop. So feel free to join us for that. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you everyone for coming. I really appreciate the great questions and your patience, and I hope it was beneficial to all of you.
Thank you so much. Goodbye, everyone. Have a wonderful week.
Right, Jasmine. Jasmine, I'm sorry for calling you Yasmin. I'm used to that version. That's my daughter's name.
Oh no, not at all. I was actually very flattered you even remembered my name.
Yasmin, it's Jasmine, not Yasmin.
It's been so long, but yeah, I'll make sure I keep in touch. I'll probably email you sometime this week.
Yeah, there was a gentleman on here, Ethan Connolly. I was trying to answer his question, but I think he's gone. I can't find. I'm not good at following this. Well, Ethan Connolly, if you're still on here, you can email me and I'll answer your question. Oh, there he is. Okay, take care. Thank you, Tiffany. Thanks for everything. Thanks, Star. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Take care.
You too.